Hello everyone, Joshua Smith, Apollo's Artifacts, July 2018. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Communist Manifesto, specifically the 10 planks that are set out in these 1848 writings by Karl Marx in association with his friend and supplementer of lots of money, Friedrich Engels. I will tell you right off the top that my assessment of this is not near as dire as what you typically get from libertarians and conservatives, where they'll go over the 10 planks and then they'll say that, well, all 10 of these are already in place, or 9 of them, or 8 of them, or whatever. My assessment on it is actually much better than that in terms of the worldview of a libertarian or a conservative. When you look at it from the perspective of communists, they say, of course, these 10 have not been put into place. Communists, when they take a look at this, they just say, well, this is just a collection of really good ideas, really good suggestions. These are things that need to be done in order to improve society. A communist would tell you that even with all 10 of these in place, that still does not even reach to the level of socialism. And of course, in Marx's vision, the way he saw it was that it was historically inevitable that there would be a transition from capitalism to socialism, from socialism ultimately to communism, where the state would magically wither away. For my point of view, communism is an open manifestation of evil masquerading as good. For the communists, they don't see this at all. They think that it is actually very much better than the capitalistic situation that we tend to have now, but it's mixed with a lot of socialist elements. I think it's also important here to note that Marx did call for the violent overthrow of existing institutions in this 1848 writing of the Communist Manifesto. A lot of people try to brush past that. Also, people have pointed out that this is tied into the way that you had the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in Russia, and the way that Mao went about instituting communism in China. However, it's also important to note that Marx himself did not believe that you could jump straight from an agrarian or non-industrial or non-advanced society in terms of its economic arrangements directly to communism. He didn't think that that was possible at all, which a lot of communists attribute to that's why so many people ended up dying in these revolutions that were forced far too early. But before we get into it, I think it's also interesting to take note of the way that Marx himself was somewhat fascinated with El Diablo, ye olde devil himself, the way that he wrote some of his poems with an interest in Satan, shall we say, and one of his later acolytes, Saul Elinsky, who of course was an intellectual mentor for both Hillary Rodham Clinton and Barack Hussein Obama. This is, of course, not to say at all that these people were Satanist or encouraged devil worship or anything like that. I don't think that was their interest at all. I just think that it shows sort of the dark position from which they theorized about things in the world. And we'll look at some of the things that Marx wrote in some of his poems early in his life. Now, Marx was part of a Jewish family that, because of where they lived, they were forced to convert to Christianity, Lutheranism to be specific. Later, Marx, of course, became an atheist, and this could be somewhat related, I guess, to the way that he saw things. So let's look at some portions of poems here. He said, "Then I will be able to walk triumphantly like a god through the ruins of their kingdom. Every word of mine is fire and action. My breast is equal to that of the Creator. I shall build my throne high overhead. Cold, tremendous shall its summit be, for its bulwarks, superstitious dread, for its martial, blackest agony. See this sword, the prince of darkness sold it to me. With Satan I have struck my deal. He chalks the signs, beats time for me. I play the death march, fast and free." That obviously bears no relationship to anything we've ever seen from communism so far as it's played out on the planet. Let's take a look here at another one that he wrote, and this really draws forth, as he delved more into the rationalism of his time, the mechanistic view of the world, the materialistic view of the world, with any sense of a deity excised from it. He said, "I shall howl gigantic curses on mankind. Ha! Eternity, she is an eternal grief. Ourselves being clockwork, blindly mechanical, made to be the foul calendars of time and space, having no purpose save to happen to be ruined, so that there shall be something to ruin. If there is something which devours, I'll leap within it. Though I bring the world to ruins, the world which bulks between me and the abyss, I will smash to pieces with my enduring curses. I'll throw my arms around its harsh reality. Embracing me, the world will dumbly pass away and then sink down to utter nothingness, perished with no existence. That would be really living. The leaden world holds us fast, and we are chained, shattered, empty, frightened, eternally chained to this marble block of being, and we are the apes of a cold God. And then we'll transition from that to taking a look at Saul Elinsky's Rules for Radicals, a pragmatic primer for realistic radicals. Now, a lot of people say that Elinsky was dedicating his book and all of his ideas to Satan. I don't think that's actually accurate. This portion actually was in an epigraph to the book where he said, quote, "Lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical from all our legends, mythology, and history, and who is to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which? The very first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer." And of course, he's not meaning Lucifer here in the sense of Venus or the light bringer or anything like that. He is, again, referencing El Diablo himself. So you can take those two things with a grain of salt or make of them what you will. Now, there's another thing that I found interesting as I was preparing for this. There are a lot of Democrats and progressives online who seem to think that the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto actually are not real and that there's some kind of a conspiracy theory on behalf of conservatives. But I think this just reveals the fact that they haven't read as much as they need to read. So I have here the source. This is from montclair.edu. I'll link it below. Manifesto of the Communist Party, Marx and Engels, February 1848. It is from the Marx Engels Selected Works, Volume 1, Progress Publishers, Moscow, 1969, specifically on pages 26 and 27. And we begin here with plank number 1. Abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. A lot of people try to say that this has been fulfilled because there are property taxes and the existence of eminent domain. I don't really agree with that. Obviously, we still, in the United States anyway, have significant leeway to privately own property. Yes, the government does own a lot of land, and yes, we've seen violations with the Bureau of Land Management trying to confiscate people's land. We do see land confiscations of all sorts related to environmental purposes and others. But I think a lot of that stuff could be changed if you actually happen to have leadership in place who would offer those things to be sold to private landowners, which is what should be done to get them out of the hands of the government. While it is true that if you don't pay your property taxes, that usually takes 1, 2, 3 years, sometimes 5 years before anything is really done about it, and then eventually you will be fined. Your land indeed can be confiscated in order to pay, but in most cases that is not what happens, and usually the property taxes are not so outrageous that you can't pay them. Now, I do get the moral principle that it is wrong to have a tax on your property, especially if it's property that you've already fully paid for, but that is not the same as what Marx is calling here in terms of abolition of property and land, period. That is not what is the case. So I put an X there. Number 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Yes. Sort of a qualified yes, but that actually is in place. You'll notice that Democrats and progressives always call for it to become increasingly graduated. They always want to punish the wealthy. They always want to punish the makers more so that they can supposedly give it to more of the takers. But I'm a little bit skeptical of what they actually want to do with that money anyway. But I would give a check there and say that that one actually is in place to some extent. 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. No, absolutely not. That is not in place. Yes, there are estate taxes. There are inheritance taxes depending on where you live. I don't agree with those at all. They should not be in place. If you have, say, 3 children and $210,000 saved up, and once you croak, you want to give 70, 70, and 70 to your children, you should be able to do so unhindered by the government, because really, as you earned all that money to begin with, you were being taxed on it in various places already, whether it was your employer or sales taxes, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that money has already been taxed before you even get to save it. So, yeah, I would have to put an X there. That is not really in place. Thank goodness for that, too. It's actually, I have a kind of an optimistic perspective of it here, contrary to many of my libertarian and conservative pals. Number 4, confiscation of the property of immigrants and rebels. And they do not mean immigrants with an I, as in those who are coming in, but immigrants as in people who are leaving. And clearly that is not in place. If you want to, well, you obviously can't take large items with you, but you can sell off everything and take your things with you. The government isn't going to confiscate all that stuff. There are lots of ways to get your things out of the country. And rebels, I'm not so sure what this would translate to today, perhaps terrorists or something. I'm not real sure what that would be. It doesn't really apply so much in our condition today as, he was writing for this for a very specific time and place. He was actually commissioned to write this. He actually had to be convinced by Engels to write this. And Marx, he was kind of harebrained. He was all over the place, like he would start like 10 different projects at once, and he would leave all kinds of things like a third of the way done, halfway done. He starts reading like 50 other books. I mean, that's all the guy ever did. I mean, he really never had any legitimate jobs. He just sat around in libraries reading stuff and taking pages and pages of notes all the time. And sometimes he would haphazardly gather all this stuff together and put out something halfway coherent. But he was not a systematic, intellectual, systematic thinker, writer, or worker at all in any sense. So I give an X for that one. Number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state. I give this one a check minus. You do have the Federal Reserve Act. You do have a lot of problems there in terms of centralization of banking and credit and loans and all this sort of stuff, which has had absolutely egregious effects in the United States and other Western countries that have duplicated that same model. So check minus on that one. Yeah, I give it a pass, barely. Number 6, centralization of the means of communications and transport in the hands of the state. Also give a check minus on this. Yes, you do have departments of transportation. You have the FCC, which licenses radio and television and all that. So ultimately it does put the control of that in the hands of the state. Thank goodness. We still have podcasting and YouTube stuff here available where we actually do not have to have a license in order to do this, to exercise our free speech rights, which are inherent to humanity, not just something that's granted by government that can simply be taken away by government. That is not the way that we should look at rights. Rights are absolute. But okay, a check minus on that. Yeah, I'll give that one. Number 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. I can't really pass this one. I'm not real sure how he would mean that. And most factories and instruments of production are indeed owned by private people today, although, of course, you do have taxes and licensure, et cetera, et cetera. So you could, in some sense, say the state is always a super owner of those things, but it's still not really what Marx would have meant by that, so I have to put an X there. 8, equal obligation to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Also have to put an X there. Clearly, we do not have an equal obligation to work. There are record numbers of people, at least set under the Obama administration. I know some of that's changing now that Trump is in, as employment has gone up, but there were certain disturbing accomplishments under Obama where you had the highest numbers ever of 3 generations of the same family who had never worked in their lives and had always lived on the government dole. That is absolutely outrageous and unbelievable, preposterous. So I have to put an X there. Number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of distinction between town and country. I also have to put an X there. I mean, some agriculture and manufacturing industries are combined, but those are, mostly through capitalist or free market processes. And this gradual abolition of distinction between town and country, I would suppose he means cities and rural areas. Obviously, there's a colossal divide there, as was shown in the most recent election. You can look at the red and blue distributions on the map and see that the big blue cities are not at all the way that the people in the red areas see the world. You have the flyover country. You have the people who are the sort of intellectual elites who are the producers of information in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and New York City, they do not see the world the same way as people in so-called flyover country. So this one also I have to put an X by. That has just not happened. And certainly the government is not doing anything to compel, this distribution of people across town and country. It's just not going on. Number 10, free education of all children in public schools, abolition of child factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. I give a full check mark on that. Obviously, that has been done. And you have to understand, too, that when Marx was talking about this, he didn't simply mean free education of all children in public schools. He did mean compulsory education where the children would be forced to go, or else there would be punishments for the family. And, of course, once you punish the families in order to send the children there, you know that the children are being sent there to be basically controlled by the state, indoctrinated by the state, and that's exactly what we see playing out today. And that's why more and more people are choosing to homeschool their kids to get them out of that system. As to the part here where he says abolition of child factory labor in its present form, obviously, if he said in its present form, he didn't mean the complete abolition of all child labor. And child labor had to happen back then as more people moved from the rural areas off of the farms and whatnot and into the cities, or else they were all going to be starving to death, because that was what was happening before that. Combination of education with industrial production. Well, you can see that Dewey and others who were in control of the early formation of the educational system, that they did primarily want to train the students to be so-called good workers, or basically factory workers and things like that. I would say that the system has ultimately even failed on that endeavor. I mean, that's sort of typical of how government programs play out. They have these plans of what they want to bring out, and then they just end up smashing everything and making it a big joke and a huge disaster. So I have to put an X by that. We have overall then 4 out of 10 of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, which are more or less in place right now. But of course, that does not mean that this is communism. Again, he thought that this would be something that would lead to socialism, and then from socialism to communism. But anyway, hopefully I clarified some things there for people, and please like, subscribe, share this around, and all that. Thanks.